Guys.
Hi, this is Avery.
And this is Skylar.
And this is our Unit 1 review of AP World History.
Yes.
Today's theme for this unit, what's the theme for this unit?
So, the main theme of Unit 1 is how we see the collapsing of old empires and the rising of new. For example, the collapse of the Tang Dynasty that would eventually lead into the Song Dynasty, or the collapsing of the Abbasid Caliphate, which would eventually lead to the Seljuk Turks, with many sultanates such as the Delhi Sultanate, and so on. So, the first thing we got to get into is the political situation of China.
Yes.
So, if you want to start us off, what's going on in China politically at this time?
So at this time period, China was organized in an imperial bureaucracy, which is basically where there's one major power, the emperor in this case, who had a ton of little government officials throughout the empire, enforcing and making sure that all of his
almost like
wants
governors.
and needs were like being enforced and
Right.
kept everything in order for him. So
also, Avery, so tell me, what was a way, and it's a huge part of Chinese culture, what was a way that people could get jobs in the imperial bureaucracy in China?
So in Song China, in this period, the civil service exam, or basically just state-driven exams, were available, and they were the only way for people to get jobs in the bureaucracy, which just promoted education and made sure that all of the government officials were well-educated officials, and they didn't just get the jobs because they knew
someone?
people.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's something new we see in China at this time, is how people are chosen based off their merit, not just because they know someone. The only thing is with the civil service exam is you have to get tutoring to be put through this exam, which was
very hard.
It was very hard. They had to sit in a room for a couple days. We don't even know the specifics, but basically, see, this is where we see, though, there's going to be a lot of richer Chinese people getting these jobs, essentially, because they can afford the tutoring and the poor cannot. Which leads to a kind of an imbalance when we're talking in political rule, but either way, it is based off of merit rather than...
Overall, it had a pretty positive effect on...
And it stays valid in China for a really long time.
Yeah.
And we see when it does get abolished during the Manchu period. That leads to a lot of problems in China.
And then let's talk about religion in Song China.
So, cultural.
Yeah,
let's get into cultural. So, what do you want to start with?
So, let's just start off with the predominant ideology of Song China, which was...
Confucianism.
Yes.
So, Confucianism is big in China, and it will always be. I would say even now. When we look at, Chinese populations, how they're very motivated on school, we get that from Confucianism initially. So, Confucianism gives everything a perfect social order. Everything has a role. Goes in with how do you say it?
Filial piety.
Filial piety, which is essentially to respect one's elders and get respect. And
if you remember that one scene in Mulan, that's how I remember filial piety. It's when she's like, ancestors.
There you go. So, but here's the thing that is interesting around this time. We begin to see the development of Neo-Confucianism, which essentially means New Confucianism. And Neo-Confucianism is...
basically just the revival of Confucianism in the Song period. Confucian teachings were central to the civil service exam system, and it was associated with the state since around 100, Common Era, or...
long time.
AD. So a long time even before this period that we're talking about. But the influence of Buddhism, because Buddhism was on the rise in China during this period, and people were not having it. So they wanted to combine this new religion with their old principles to make sure that they didn't just get washed away by this new religion.
Right.
So they created their own account of the human and physical world in response to competition from Buddhism, and Neo-Confucianism's main ideas were self-cultivation and a path to self-fulfillment, and also forming a virtuous and harmonious society and state.
Right. So back to Buddhism. At this time, it is rapidly spreading through China and East Asia.
Yeah.
And so one of the things we're seeing is many different branches of Buddhism. For example, we have Mahayana and Theravada Buddhism, and one of these was more favored. I was going to figure out which one.
I think Mahayana was for the people and Theravada was like the monks.
Right, so one of them was more like, oh, well, you're screwed if you haven't done these things. You're not getting salvation. The other one was like, anyone can get it, which was obviously more popular.
I think Theravada Buddhism was the monks who, it was like practiced only by like a few select groups of monks who like lived secluded lives and devoted their entire lives to Buddhism. Yeah. And like
Mahayana was like more for everyone.
Yeah.
So the next thing we get onto is like the economic sides of China, the economy. Yeah. So the economy saw in China became increasingly commercialized while continuing to depend on free peasant and artisan labor. So commercialization, it's a weird term, but it essentially is meaning how China is producing more than the demand. So they are always producing and exporting goods. And at this time, their main goods would be silk and porcelain. Do you want to talk about like champa rice?
Yeah. Well, champa rice is more of a population thing, but we can go into that in a little minute. But another part of the Song economy was that merchants became a lot more specialized and organized in partnerships. And this is where we start to see the first joint stock companies with a separation between owners and managers. Merchants organized into guilds, and these guilds would arrange sales from wholesalers to shop owners. Right. And this, we'll see this throughout our all of our AP worlds, because later on we see the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company, which like kind of took some of the ideas of this original Song joint stock companies.
So, China is initially thriving due to the Silk Road, as most economies are at this time. One main thing to mention is the Grand Canal, which obviously expanded like trade networks. They could transport more, export more, initially just making them more money. Yeah. Is there anything else you want to say about China?
Yes, just one more thing. I'm going to define joint stock companies for myself. Just, of course. I like to know what I'm talking about. So a joint stock company is a company whose stock is owned jointly by the shareholders, which limits the amount of risk in these kind of trade endeavors. A group of people all own a piece of a company or private a business. Yeah.
So that's essentially what that is. Next thing I think we got to get into is 1.2, developments in Dar al-Islam. Yes. And for anyone who does not know, Dar al-Islam technically just translates to House of Islam and essentially referring to the Middle East at this time. Yeah. So, Avery, do you want to start us off with our Dar al-Islam and political?
Yes, I would love to. So, as the Abbasid Caliphate fragmented, new Islamic political entities emerged, most of which were dominated by Turkic peoples, which a few of these examples of new empires who were or not empires, but political entities that formed were the Seljuk Empire, the Mamluk Sultanate, and the Delhi Sultanate. You want to keep going?
So the thing is here, which is very interesting about the new Darwinism, essentially, is because after the collapse of the Abbasid Caliphate, which we need to remember that was because they had hired Turkic people, Seljuk nomadic Turkish people, to work for them in the military. They gave the Turkish people weapons, and they essentially rebelled. Yeah. And the Abbasid Caliphate fell, but led to the rise of Turkic people. And this also shows how the rise of Turkish Muslims starts to occur during this time period, and kind of more the fall of Arab Muslims. Yeah, okay. At this time period. So, we do end up seeing the Seljuk Empire, the Mamluk Sultanate, and the Delhi Sultanate. Yeah. Throughout the Middle East and East Asia. Or Southeast Asia. Yeah.
So what was happening in the education systems in Dar al-Islam? What was, important about what they did?
So I would say this is definitely a cultural thing. Yeah. That's happening, or maybe social, but they have a lot of texts going on. So Islam is essentially thriving at this time innovationally. So, they developed the House of Wisdom, which is a huge library in Baghdad, which basically, what happens here is a lot of Arab and Turkish scholars go here, and Muslim scholars go here, and they translate texts from Greek, Rome, and old ancient texts.
Yeah, and they make commentaries on them,
Right. And they translate them to Arab and other languages. And here's the thing that gets really interesting, is that these books, these knowledge, it gets transported along the Silk Road. So we see obviously the transportation of goods, but now we're also seeing the transportation of knowledge and literary.
And if we didn't have the Arabs translating all of these works and maintaining them and keeping them and making commentaries on them, we wouldn't have these philosophers. We wouldn't still have the works of these Greek philosophers. Like all of these people, they were maintained through them, so we have them to thank. And although the House of Wisdom the House of Wisdom fell only a few years after our period starts, in around 1200 they fell. It's important to note that they
wasn't an empire.
I don't know, but the House of Wisdom it fell.
Okay.
They broke it down, I think.
So anyway,
wait, let me look.
Okay, a little bit of intermission there. I'm gonna kind of talk about more of how the Muslim rule started to expand more. So obviously we see the Seljuk Turks are in control in Darul Islam, and we're seeing Islam expand through activities of merchants, missionaries, and Sufis, which are basically Muslim teachers and missionaries.
It was, sorry.
No, go ahead.
The House of Wisdom in Baghdad was destroyed in 1258 during the Mongol siege of Baghdad.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the Mongols we will get into next year.
Yeah.
Also, one thing is really big in Darul Islam is the religion. So obviously we know it's predominantly Muslim, but we also see the spread of Judaism and Christianity in here, and they all essentially share a lot of the same beliefs. Hence, monotheism, belief in one God, versus polytheism, which is belief in multiple gods.
Yeah, and Islam is pretty much just based on Judaism. It's just another prophet that they added. Right.
So we do see that. And those obviously continue to shape societies in Africa and Asia. The next thing, we already kind of talked about it, was innovations, just how they spread through the Silk Road and all that. And I think now we can get into 1.3, developments in South and Southeast Asia.
Yes, I agree.
Do you want to start with political?
Yeah. So states were forming, and there was a lot of development, which demonstrated continuity, innovation, and diversity, including the new Hindu and Buddhist states that emerged in South and Southeast Asia, namely Srivijaya, Via Hyanjara, and Khmer. Yeah.
You want me to go on?
Yeah.
So we are seeing formation of new states at this time. I just want to kind of get into cultural. We're obviously, we're in South and Southeast Asia, close to India, obviously. And, we have a lot of flourishing of Hinduism, Islam, and Buddhism. And those are the core beliefs around this time.
Yeah.
And they just continue to shape societies in South and Southeast Asia. We also see the rise of Sufism, which I want to say is kind of a religious syncretism between Islam, Hinduism.
No.
Yeah? Or is that Sikhism? That might be Sikhism.
Sufis. Well, yeah.
So but we also see the Bhakti movement.
Yeah. Bhakti movement was, what religion was that a part of?
I'll do a search.
Yeah.
Essentially we're just seeing, a lot of, so the Bhakti movement was a series of Hindu devotional trends that emerged in medieval India, emphasizing personal devotion to a single deity over religious. Yeah, so it's kind of showing, it's kind of the monotheistic side of Hinduism, which is very interesting because Hinduism is polytheistic.
Yeah.
Did you want to talk about Sufism?
Yes, you were actually right. I was not.
Was I right?
So Sufism is a mystical branch of Islam that emphasizes a personal, direct relationship with God through spiritual practices like meditation, prayer, and devotion.
So I just want to add to how Sufism is a prime example of religious syncretism, which we're going to see a lot later, especially in the Americas. But it totally shows a blending of Hinduism, Islam, and even some Buddhism. But with that, I think we can get into the Americas. 1.4, developments in the Americas.
Okay.
So I'll start us off with some political stuff. So in the Americas, as in Afro-Eurasia, state systems demonstrated continuity, innovation, and diversity, and expanded in scope and reach. So an example of this would be the Maya city-states and the Aztecs and the Incan Empire.
Yes.
So one thing I want to talk about is how the Inca were highly centralized.
Yes, and the Aztec were highly decentralized.
So do you want to kind of talk about what that means?
Well, So I know the Inca had a major system put in place called, what was it called? Oh.
Tribute?
No, the Aztecs had a tribute system.
Right.
They had...
to take them.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well.
So, I can't think of an exact name, but you're on the right track. The Incan at this time, as they were highly centralized, what this initially was meaning is that they're not colonies, but after they conquered somewhere, they had a tribute system. I'm pretty sure both did this.
Yeah.
With the Inca, they would always be, like, peering in on the conquering people, you know, kind of like, oh, like, you know, you guys doing everything you can, following the Midas system, which we will get into in a second.
Yeah.
Rather in the Aztec Empire, they were more like, all right, we conquered you, that's it.
Yeah.
We're not gonna, you know, peek on you guys and everything.
Yeah. So. And just location-wise, the Aztecs developed in what is now Mexico and was dominated by the semi-nomadic Mexica people who migrated from northern Mexico. And then the Inca Empire was a Mesoamerican civilization in the Andes Mountains in South America that by the end of the 1400s, which were not in that era though, it was the largest empire in the Americas.
Yeah. So that's a big thing. I also want to talk about the Midas system, which is happening at this time in the Americas, which is essentially like the system where the Incan, I'm pretty sure it was the Incans who used it, they sponsored, or they basically said that everyone has to, like, help on, like, government projects, essentially, which obviously shows the centralization of, you know, unification during this time. And with that, is there anything else you want to add? Maybe, like, their farming?
The farming of
they had, like, it was an interesting name, but they were just very innovative with their farming. I'm not sure if it's really much of a must-know, but so it's the population growth, whatever. Yeah. All right, the next thing, we have 1.5 developments in Africa.
Yep.
Do you want to start?
Yes, I would love to.
That's a typo.
Okay. In Africa, as in Eurasia and the Americas, state systems demonstrated continuity, innovation, and diversity, and expanded in both scope and reach. Some examples of this are Great Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, and the Hosa Kingdoms.
Right, so Great Zimbabwe, we know, gets essentially rich off, you know which one? One of the three major trade networks.
Great Zimbabwe, was it a land-based empire or a maritime?
Land.
So, Silk Roads.
Close. Trans-Saharan.
Oh, okay.
So, these, in Africa, we see, like, Africa's interesting because they have a bit of everything. Trans-Saharan, a little bit of Silk Road, though the Silk Road, not as much. And Indian Ocean trade, which we will get into in the next unit. But at this time, these African countries are starting to get really rich. We even see Mansa Musa, who was initially
he was the emperor, or he was the king of Mali, right?
Right, and he is the richest person of all time. No one has been able to out-money him.
And he spread his wealth on his pilgrimage, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another thing is religions at this time. So we always have seen that Ethiopia has been a Christian state, while Great Zimbabwe and the Hosa Kingdoms have, although continued to hold on to their cultural traditions of religion, but also blending with Islam as Muslim merchants made their way down there. So, with that being said, I think we can get into 1.6 developments in Europe.
Okay.
If you want to start feudalism and all that.
So, socially, we are going to just start with how Europe was largely an agricultural society, and it was dependent on free and coerced labor, including serfdom, which we're going to see throughout this unit, or throughout this... I don't know the word for it.
You're right.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to look up...
No problem. So... what's going on in Europe is the feudalism. This is more political, but we see a lot of decentralization in Europe at this time. And although they do have a monarchy, they have a king, they have the manorial system in feudalism, which essentially has tiny little empires, not empires, but, you know, tiny little kingdoms everywhere, which is obviously not united. Feudalism, the practice of kind of like a social hierarchy. You know, you have peasants at the bottom, vassals, lords, nobles, and kings at the top. And the manorial system, and this is where serfdom comes into play, the peasants were essentially bound to the land. They were
so kind of like slavery, but not exactly, because they were bound to the land instead of a person.
Right. So that kind of shows, differences. They also got to eat whatever they farmed, which obviously wasn't a lot, but
yeah.
so something there. And the manorial system is essentially that. It's just how the peasants were bound to the manors. And the manors, not necessarily a big house. It's more like a piece of land.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think, cultural, I don't know if you want to talk about it. Religion is definitely thriving in Europe, especially as the collapse of the Byzantine.
The main religions in Europe at this time period were Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and the core beliefs and practices of these religions continued to shape societies in Europe. So, and they will continue to for a long, long time.
Right.
Yeah.
So Christianity is obviously thriving. And honestly, I think that is everything for Unit 1.
Yeah.
So anything other notes you want to add?
I mean, I think we covered
everything.
Yeah.
And then we'll see you guys in Unit 2.
Yes, thanks, guys.
Subscribe. Bye.